We're going to do it right here, twice a year. And I think if we can, we like to hear stories. We like to hear our own stories a little bit. And by doing so, you know, we come together even closer. We come to know one another. And we bond together more as a community of Christ. And so I thought what I'd like to do is to share my Cursillo journey with you. And then afterwards, if we could break off into groups of 3 and not be part of the, you know, from the same community, the same diocese, but break off and maybe share for 5 minutes your Cursillo journey. And I know that's 5 minutes is going to be a lot of time, but there are some things you can, I'm sure, share with one another. You know, I doubt very much if any of us here made our weekend just a year ago. I'm sure we've been in the movement to really to become into this position of leadership that you all have. And so I'd just like to go ahead and to share those stories with one another. My story began back in the fall of 1981. That's when I made my Cursillo weekend. It was men's 58th Joliet Diocese. And I would be willing to bet that the experience that I had from that weekend was probably a lot different than any of yours. And I know that we're all unique and we all, you know, experience something different, but there are a lot of similarities that we can hear at closings. And let me explain how that change took place, because it really began about 3 months, actually a couple of months before that, in August of 1981. And actually in May of 81. Belonged to St. Pius X Parish in Lombard. And I think Father Bob probably knows Father Joe Shamanik. He was the pastor at that parish. And my wife and I, Nancy, got to know Father Joe extremely well. He was a very dear friend of ours. But anyway, he invited a Redemptorist priest from Brooklyn, New York, who had a healing ministry, to come to St. Pius. And it was the whole Marian thing. So it was a 3-day affair. And he would lay hands on people after 7 o'clock Mass in that evening. And my wife went to I think the second meeting of those 3 days. And she was sitting somewhere in the middle pews. And as he walked down, processed down the middle aisle there to, you know, celebrate Mass, as he walked by, my wife felt a heat that just went through her whole body. And it really touched her life. It scared me. It scared me. And when he left, I was glad he left. But he came back in August for a week. And every night he would have Mass at 7 o'clock. And afterwards he would pray over people. And those evenings we'd get 4,000 or 5,000 people that came to that parish. And it would go on until about 1 o'clock in the morning. And all through that entire week, I had a knot in my stomach. I couldn't eat. I didn't eat the whole week. I lost about 11, 12 pounds in that week. So I was just emotionally all just in total disarray. I really thought I was losing her. Somehow. I was just scared. I was frightened. But the only time that I really had peace was in that evening. It was at Mass. And that was just total freedom when Mass was being said. But 15 minutes afterwards, that knot would come right to my gut. I remember on a Wednesday afternoon, noontime, going to a nearby horse preserve from work, and just poured it out. What are you doing? You know, this is the Lord. And I just pleaded with him to free me. Just pleaded with him, free me. And I heard an answer. It was a single word. That was soon. So I went back, still had that knot, and he concluded on Saturday night with the Mass. And the Mass was great, and afterwards I still had that knot. And then that Sunday afternoon, I was leaving for out of town to go on business. And I'm not sure when it happened. Someday on Sunday, I can't recall exactly. But all of a sudden, that knot was removed. I felt a freedom that I'd never experienced before in my life. I felt so free that I felt I could almost fly. It was just incredible freedom. I remember getting to where I was going and called Nancy. We just talked for about an hour, just about anything and everything. And so I just began doing things that I never did before. I stopped doing things that I had done before. My whole life was just changed, totally 180 degrees. I don't think I watched television for a year. It didn't interest me. Nothing interested me at all on television. And so, one of the fellows asked me if I would make a Cursillo weekend. And I said yes. And so I made that weekend. And so at the conclusion of that weekend, I was already there. The whole weekend, I was already on the mountaintop. You know what I mean? And so when that concluded, there was none of this, oh wow, this was a fantastic weekend. It just touched my life. Now it was a good weekend, don't get me wrong. But I was already there. But what it did do, it gave me the tools. I didn't quite realize it at the time, but it gave me the tools. It gave me the tools to go on. And so I began to work a couple of weekends and did some grouping. But then, unfortunately, I kind of fell away from that. And at some point, a couple of years down the road, and just fell away from Cursillo. Then in 1989, a good friend of mine from St. Pius was asked to be the team coordinator for the men's 77th weekend. And Bob asked me if I would be the kitchen chair. I said yes. And really it's been from that point on that I've been totally involved with Cursillo since that time. So the next weekend, at the 78th, I worked that weekend, and I was asked to give the study talk. And I mentioned before, I did some things that I hadn't done before. One of those things was reading. I never read before 1981. Really never read. And then after that, I read a lot. And most of it was to some type of spiritual type readings. And I just grew into it. I would find an author and I would just read his books. I don't know if any of you recall the Father John, shame on me, Irish guy from, pardon?
Shea?
No, he's Father, I'll think of it, from Loyola University, psychologist, and he wrote very John Powell, Father John Powell, Jesuit. And he wrote a number of books on the bestsellers, as a matter of fact. I read all his books. Thomas Burton, I read a number of his. Got into Henry Nouwen, read a number of his books. So I was always reading all this. So when they asked me to give this study talk, it kind of fit, it really fit. And I was really excited about it. And I would go take long walks, and ideas and everything would be running around in my head, and I was just so excited about it. Wrote a little outline on the thing. I thought I could just come on out there, and speak for 45 minutes on study, And I was just so excited. So the weekend came, and it's Friday afternoon came, and all of a sudden, there was that knot. I was, for whatever reason, I felt a certain fear came over me. And it really started to get me. And so that night, I remember going after supper, just walking outside and kind of slapping myself in the face, going, you gotta get under control here. I was really tight on this thing. Get under control. I couldn't, and it just kept getting worse. And it got so bad that the thought even occurred to my mind that, you know what? Maybe I just go get my things, get out of here, just leave. That thought actually occurred to me. I dismissed it right away, but even that thought that entered my mind that I should just get up and get my stuff and leave. Obviously I didn't. And then that whole evening was difficult. And then about 10:30, I was just sitting outside our room, and one of his fellow workers came up, Cursillistas came up, and, how you doing? I said, well, not too good. And he came by and sat with me for about an hour and a half, and he would have sat with me all night. And just to try to calm me down, and he did to some extent. So I had about 1 hour's sleep that night. Got up, had that knot. It was there, not quite as bad, but I had it. And so I went into the Planka Chapel, to pray before I went into the conference room with that talk. maybe the pocket shovel, this whole thing would change. Huh? Got into the conference room, and no such luck. All I could do was pretty much read the outline. And that talk, I think, lasted 10-minute study talk. And I remember after reading the outline, and everyone knew that I was really in tough shape, bad shape on that talk. I remember just facing the candidates and telling them that, for whatever reason or reasons, this didn't work out. But I was truly okay with myself. And I really was at that point. Everything left then. I was okay because I knew that I really put in the time and the effort. I just didn't do it right, apparently. But I did put in all this time. And I says, I'm okay with myself. And the only thing that I'm sorry about is that, I wasn't able to get across this beautiful message of study. And one of the candidates, and I told him that I loved you guys, I told him I loved him. One of the candidates got right up, came up to me and gave me a big embrace before I left. I think it's in 2 Corinthians. Paul was, he had that thorn in his side. And he said, Lord, take this thorn away. And God answered him, my grace is enough for you. For weakness, power reaches perfection. I think that that's what the Lord did, because I remember that night just absolutely giving that whole feeling, everything about myself that night to the Lord. Said, if you want to, if it's what you want is for me to be a clown out there, I'll do it. Whatever you want, whatever you want. And I think He took that weakness. I think He turned it around, because that evening or that afternoon, 3 of the candidates came on separate times, knocked on my door and said, I want you to know how much that talk touched me. And that wasn't me. It was the Lord that turned that weakness to strength, to power. To power. And so then after that, I began working a lot of weekends. Our whole diocese was just changing. It was just a rebirth of Cursillo in our diocese. It was just a revival, a whole explosion. We were getting 35, 40, 45 candidates on these weekends, both men and women. And so there was just a great explosion to the diocese in Cursillo. And so I began working on these particular weekends. And then I think it was the men's 84th was asked to be the team coordinator for that particular weekend. And I said yes. And I won't get into what that, the weekend was fine, it was worked out well. But one of the highlights for me was that I received 2 letters from my sons. Not late weekends, they were like 20 and 15 years old at the time. And I'm sure my wife had told them to go ahead and write Dad a letter. And I still have those letters. And every once in a while, if I feel a little bit down on myself or feel a little bit down, all I need to do is go take those letters. And I read them. And one of my oldest son, one of the parts of his letter, he said, Dad, he says, someday I hope to get married and have some children. He said, if I can be just the half dad that you are, I'd be happy. Let me tell you, and I say this in all sincerity and honesty and humility, both my sons are better fathers than I ever was. Not better fathers. Every night they pray with their children. And it just gives me great joy knowing where they're at. So then anyway, I just kept working certificate, been involved, and shortly thereafter I was asked to be a part of the secretariat. And I said yes, and came on the secretariat and was involved there for about 4.5 years. And then the time came, kept moving on. And then in 2008, correction, November of 2005, I received a phone call from the lay director at that time, Pat Millay, God rest her soul. and she asked me if I would be the lay director for the diocese. And this came right out of the blue. I had no clue on this, right out of the blue. Is it bad? I don't know. I'll have to think about this, that's for sure, and pray about it. And I started pondering over all this and thinking about, you know, involved and all that. And I always came to the conclusion at the end that, you know, I think I better take a pass on this. I'm not sure I can handle it. I always kept coming back to that response. And I finally just started talking to my wife, Nance. Mentioned to her, I says, I've been asked to be the lay director. And very first thing she said, without any hesitation, she says, of course you'll say yes. You'll do a good job. I says, you know, and she has always supported me. All these times that I worked weekends, you know, we had 4 children. At times they were just like 12 years old, down to 6, and you know, as the years went by. But she always supported me. Always said, of course, go work the weekend if you're called to do that. And I felt that support from her right down there. You know, and it's almost like, how could I almost say no? You know, I heard a wonderful definition of love. And I think I might have shared this once before with some of you folks here. It's from M. Scott Peck and The Road Less Traveled. And he described love. And he said, first of all, he prefaced that by saying that there's no right, perfect definition for love, he thought. That was his thinking. Because it's just too vast and too broad, too profound. But he said the best definition that I could come up with, he says, is the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's spiritual growth. I thought that was a really interesting definition. And when I read that, I couldn't help but think of my wife, Nance. She was always supporting me because she knew what Cursillo would mean for me. So she always supported me. And so, anyway. And so I said yes. And so that was obviously a 3-year commitment to Cursillo. And I will just share one part of that is that the School of Leaders was not going very well when I took over. There were maybe 3 or 4 people going to the School of Leaders. And I thought the Ultreas were going okay though. There were about 3 or 4 Ultreas, and 3 I think, and they were going pretty good. But only 3 or 4 people would come to the School of Leaders. And I thought, well, if I just make sure I'd be at all these Ultreas, you know, they'd go once a month and I'd be there at every Ultrea and just promoting to try to get for folks to consider being part of the School of Leaders. At the end of that year, we still had, so obviously I wasn't doing a very good job trying to convince people to be part of that. So then I decided to shut the School of Leaders down, which I did. And I got an ad hoc committee, about 9 folks, 9 Cursillistas, to develop a plan how we can come up with a good School of Leaders. And we met for about 10 months and finally came up with a plan. And we started that with Cursillo, I think it was in January of that following year. And I think we had about 45, 55 folks come to the School of Leaders. I think it's been going ever since that time, not necessarily 45, 50, but the School of Leaders has been moving along pretty well. So that really worked out. So as I mentioned, I had this one huge metanoia back in 1981. And I'd like to share one last metanoia that I had, which really affected my life and touched my life. About 2.5 years ago, and I think I did share this with some of you, maybe a couple of years ago, I'm not sure. But about 2.5 years ago, I had to go to the post office from work, got in the car, a relevant radio was on, and I heard this man speaking on the Mass. And I heard what he was saying for about 15 minutes. But I knew right then and there I was going to Mass the next morning. And I've been going ever since. That's how much that touched me. it was just amazing what I heard. Just filled me. And so I've been going to Mass ever since. And I had worked a week, was asked to be an assistant on one of the weekends about 6 to 8 months later. And we'd always start with Mass that evening and then go into our meeting. This was on a Wednesday night. And it was at St. Francis of Assisi Parish, in Bolingbrook, Illinois. And on the very last night of our last formation meeting, I had Mass, and I walked back out to the narthex. And I was just looking around, and I saw a CD, and it was called The Mass Explained. I said, well, I got to have that, $3 or whatever it was. And on the way home, I put it in to listen to it. And of course, that was the voice that I heard. That was the Father Larry Richards, who has the CD called The Mass Explained. And ever since that time, I'd buy 60, 70, 80 of them. And I think that I just felt that every Catholic should hear this CD. Not that they would necessarily have this huge turnaround or whatever, but I knew for sure that they would come away with a better understanding and appreciation of their Mass. And so I've been passing these things out ever since. All the Cursillo weekends that come up, the teams that are formed, I always give them a copy of the Mass Explained. And of course, I have a copy here for each one of you here tonight, today. And I just ask that you listen to it once. That's all. Just listen to it once. And I know for sure that it will give you at least a little better understanding and appreciation of the Mass. At least that's my hope. So, I'll give you this. Yes. Well, before I do that, just follow through that. So anyway, I came up with the 3 years, as lay director, and then I think the following year, sometime the summer or the fall, was contacted to be part of the service team on the Region 5. And again, I had to go through this whole process of thinking about all that, and of course said yes. And again, my wife Nancy was very much involved. Absolutely, I'm sure you'd say yes. And so, been doing that, and it has always been such a, only meet twice a year, and yet, coming together and seeing some of you folks for those past few years, and now new faces and everything. But when Cursillists come together, whether you've seen them or met anyone before for the first time, there's just a connection, just a beautiful connection that takes place. And so I appreciate that. That's some new folks here this morning. And that's a gift. That's a special gift. The gift of friendship. Beautiful gift of friendship. So anyway, that's a little bit of my journey. Cursillo, and it still goes on. Was just asked to work the next men, so be an assistant. So I said yes, of course. And it's a joy coming together and being part of this very special gift that has touched all of us and touched all of our lives in a very special way. So I'd like to pass out then. Here.
Hey Dick, I just have to say one thing.
Sure.
I don't know who does your laundry, but from my angle from back here, while you were talking, I would swear there's a cross on your chest. That's wrinkles. What you were saying.
There's a cross here.